They told them they were going to liberate a holy land. They told them God was watching, that heaven itself was counting their steps as they marched east, that every mile erased sin, every wound brought them closer to salvation. They said the cities ahead were corrupted, defiled, poisoned by unbelief. They said what waited beyond the walls was darkness, and that darkness must be cleansed. But when the gates finally broke, when the shouting turned to screaming and steel met flesh, what followed had nothing to do with salvation. It began with noise, a roar so loud it swallowed prayer itself, iron boots hammering stone, wood splintering, men yelling in languages the city's women did not understand. Then came the smell, smoke, sweat, blood, excrement, mixing into something so thick it felt like it clung to the lungs. Houses burned before their owners could flee. Doors were kicked in not to search, but to claim. This was liberation. In the summer of 1095, Pope Urban II stood before a crowd at Claremont and promised the impossible. He promised forgiveness without penance, heaven without restraint, violence without consequence. God wills it. The crowd roared back at him. And with those words, a switch was flipped across Europe. Knights abandoned feuds. Criminals abandoned gallows. Peasants abandoned fields. They stitched crosses onto their clothes and began walking toward a war none of them truly understood. The First Crusade was not an army. It was a migration of obsession. Tens of thousands of men moved east with hunger in their stomachs and scripture in their mouths. Many had never seen a city larger than their village. Many had never seen a woman outside their family. By the time they reached the eastern Mediterranean, they were starving, diseased, brutalized by months of marching, and convinced they were chosen. Medieval warfare already accepted horrors as routine. When a city resisted and fell, it was considered abandoned by God. Anything inside it was forfeit. Property could be taken. Men could be killed. Women could be claimed. This was not hidden. It was law, and the Crusades wrapped this law in holiness. From the moment the Crusaders crossed into Anatolia, civilian suffering followed them like a shadow. Villages were stripped bare. Women were seized during raids and never returned. Chroniclers mention these acts casually, as if describing weather. No outrage. No pause. Just matter-of-fact violence. When the Crusaders reached Antioch in 1098, the pattern hardened. The siege dragged on for months. Hunger gnawed at both sides. Bodies rotted in the streets. And when the city finally fell through betrayal, discipline vanished entirely. Women were dragged from homes, while fires still burned. Some were killed immediately. Others were raped in front of their families before being sold or murdered. Raymond of Aguilers, a priest who witnessed it, did not condemn the acts. He recorded them without shame, as part of victory. The most chilling detail was not the violence itself, but how quickly it became normalized. At Mahara, later that same year, the Crusaders stormed another city. What followed shocked even medieval observers. Women were violated openly in the streets. Children were slaughtered. Houses were stripped to the bone. And when food ran out, Crusaders butchered corpses, Muslim corpses, and ate them. Chroniclers describe bodies cut apart like livestock, women's bodies among them. This was not the act of a few renegades. It was mass behavior. And still, the march continued. By the time Jerusalem came into view in 1099, the Crusaders were hollowed out shells of men, sunburned, starving, delirious. They believed everything ahead of them was justified by suffering endured. That belief would explode once the city fell. Jerusalem was not a military fortress filled with soldiers. It was a living city. Families, markets, children, women who had already endured years of instability as power shifted back and forth between empires. When the walls were breached, there was no organized defense left. There was only panic. What happened next was recorded by both sides, and neither tried to soften it. Men were slaughtered first. That was expected. But women were hunted. They were pulled from hiding places, cellars, cisterns beneath dead bodies. Some were killed where they stood. Others were dragged away, screaming. Their clothes torn off as Crusaders argued over who had the right to them. Muslim women, Jewish women, Eastern Christian women. Faith did not protect them. In many cases, it made things worse. Latin Crusaders viewed local Christian women as heretics, barely better than Muslims. Armenian and Greek women were assaulted by men who shared their belief in Christ, but not their ritual. Nuns were violated on altars. Veils were ripped away as soldiers laughed and mocked their prayers. One chronicler wrote that blood flowed so heavily through the streets that it soaked sandals and stained armor to the knee. Another claimed it reached the reins of horses. Whether exaggerated or not, the scale of killing is not in doubt. What is often left unsaid is what happened in the hours after the killing slowed. Rape followed massacre like a second wave. Women were gathered and sorted. Younger women were kept alive. Older women were often killed. Noble women were marked for ransom. Poorer women were divided between soldiers. Some were sold immediately. Others were kept as camp followers, forced to cook, clean, and submit until they died or were discarded. Muslim chronicler Ibn al-Athir later wrote that the suffering of Jerusalem's women was so severe it could not be described without breaking the heart. Jewish accounts tell of women begging husbands to kill them rather than let Crusaders take them alive. Some families chose suicide over capture, locking themselves inside buildings and setting them on fire. Even Crusader sources admit that prostitutes were spared because they were seen as useful, while respectable women were abused or killed. Morality was twisted into something unrecognizable. And when the killing was finally over, when the city was quiet enough for prayer, the Crusaders walked barefoot to holy sites, thanking God for victory. They believed what they had done was righteous. Letters were sent back to Europe celebrating success. Songs were sung. The capture of Jerusalem was framed as a miracle. No mention was made of the women dragged through blood-soaked streets. No mention of the screams echoing from ruined homes. Silence erased them. But the pattern did not end in Jerusalem. Every city taken afterward followed the same rhythm. Siege, breach, slaughter, rape, enslavement. The Crusaders learned that terror worked. That cities might surrender if rumors traveled faster than armies. And so those rumors were allowed to spread, of women violated, of daughters stolen, of mothers butchered. By the end of the First Crusade, an entire region associated the sign of the cross not with mercy, but with horror. And for the women who survived, survival itself became another kind of sentence. Their bodies carried memory. Their children carried stigma. Their lives were permanently shattered by a war that called itself holy. This was only the beginning. They learned quickly that resistance meant annihilation. After Jerusalem, the idea spread faster than any army ever could. Cities heard what had happened behind those walls. They heard about blood pooling in streets, about bodies stacked so high that passageways vanished. And they heard, most clearly, about the women, about what happened when the gates opened, and mercy did not arrive with the victors. Fear became a weapon. Some cities surrendered the moment Crusader banners appeared on the horizon. Others tried to negotiate. They offered tribute. They offered hostages. They offered obedience. But surrender did not guarantee safety, especially not for women. When a city opened its gates peacefully, Crusader leaders sometimes promised protection. Those promises were spoken publicly, recorded even. But once night fell and discipline thinned, soldiers moved through streets anyway. Doors were forced open. Women were dragged out despite agreements sworn on holy relics. Oaths dissolved under torchlight. Chroniclers describe it in fragments. A line here, a sentence there. Women were taken. The captives were divided. Words stripped of detail, as if even writing them too plainly would be dangerous. But the meaning is unmistakable. By the time of the Second Crusade, this violence was no longer chaotic. It was expected. Soldiers marched with the understanding that victory came with access. Commanders used women as currency, selling captives to finance campaigns, gifting them to secure loyalty, ransoming noble women while discarding the rest. Rape became routine. Women were assaulted not only during conquest, but afterward, during occupation. Garrison towns became places of constant terror. Local women learned to avoid markets, wells, streets. Many were assaulted repeatedly by different men. Complaints meant nothing. There was no court to appeal to. No authority interested in justice for non-Christian women. Some Crusaders forced women to convert before abusing them, believing this absolved the sin. Others raped them specifically because they refused conversion, framing the act as domination over false belief. Either way, faith was twisted into justification. Muslim chroniclers record women mutilating themselves, cutting faces, breaking teeth, to appear undesirable. Others disguised themselves as elderly. Some smeared dirt and filth on their bodies, hoping revulsion might spare them. It rarely did. Mothers had daughters in wells, inside walls, beneath floors. When hiding failed, some made impossible choices. Accounts describe women killing their own children, whispering apologies through tears, convinced death was kinder than what awaited them. Jewish communities, especially those encountered during the Rhineland massacres linked to Crusader movements, recorded similar horrors. Though technically outside the Eastern campaigns, the same mentality followed the armies westward. Jewish women were raped, mutilated, murdered, sometimes after forced baptism, sometimes without it. Crusader violence did not distinguish carefully. Once unleashed, it consumed everything. Even within Crusader ranks, women were not safe. Women who traveled with the armies, wives, servants, camp followers, were frequently assaulted by their own side. Discipline was weak. Protection depended entirely on male relatives. Widows were especially vulnerable. If a husband died, his wife often became property by default, claimed by another man or sold. Prostitution flourished alongside the armies, sometimes tolerated, sometimes condemned, but always present. Yet paradoxically, prostitutes were often spared during sackings because they were seen as useful, while women deemed pure were assaulted or killed. Morality was inverted. Survival depended not on innocence, but on perceived utility. As Crusader states formed along the coast, systems of slavery solidified. Women captured during campaigns were transported to markets. Some were sent to Europe. Others were sold locally. Sexual slavery became embedded in the economy of conquest. Children born of rape faced brutal futures. Some were killed at birth. Others were abandoned. A few were absorbed into households as servants, their origins erased. For mothers, survival meant living with constant reminders of violation, and with communities that often blamed them for what they endured. Not all Crusaders celebrated these acts. There were moments of discomfort, even condemnation. A few clerics wrote of excesses. Some leaders attempted to impose restraint, issuing orders against rape, but enforcement was rare and punishment rarer still. The logic of holy war overwhelmed moral hesitation. Victory excused everything. And when restraint did appear, it was often strategic, not ethical. Women were spared only when they could be sold, ransomed, or used to maintain order. Mercy was transactional. Islamic accounts from this period do not exaggerate when they describe terror spreading ahead of Crusader armies. Cities emptied as people fled. Women were sent inland, away from coastlines and roads. Refugee camps formed, filled with survivors carrying stories too painful to repeat aloud. The trauma did not end when Crusaders withdrew. Women who survived assault faced lifelong consequences. In conservative societies, rape carried stigma. Victims were often blamed, shunned, divorced, or abandoned. Some took their own lives. Others lived in silence, carrying memories they could never share. Entire generations grew up shaped by these experiences. Stories passed from mother to daughter. Warnings whispered. Hatred hardened. The Crusaders were remembered not as warriors, but as violators. Men who used faith to excuse the unthinkable. And still in Europe, the narrative remained triumphant. Songs celebrated conquest. Chronicles praised bravery. Knights were immortalized in legend. The suffering of women was reduced to footnotes or erased entirely. Their pain did not fit the story being told. This gap between memory and myth became permanent. For the Middle East, the Crusades were not glorious adventures. They were a nightmare that arrived from the sea and left scars in bodies, families, and faith itself. And women bore the deepest wounds. Because war does not end when the swords are sheathed. For women, it continues in every step taken under fear, in every silence enforced by shame, in every child born from violence. And the Crusades ensured that this kind of suffering was not accidental. It was systemic. It was built into the idea of holy conquest. And it would not end with this generation. By the time the Third Crusade began, the violence no longer needed momentum. It had become tradition. The men who marched east after Jerusalem already knew what victory meant. They had heard the stories whispered in taverns and shouted in training yards. They knew what happened to women when a city fell. Some feared it. Many anticipated it. Few questioned it, or had taught them that bodies were currency. As Crusader states expanded and contracted, raids replaced sieges. These were not grand battles, but fast, brutal incursions into villages and towns. They targeted supply routes, farmland, families. Women were the primary objective. Not because of strategy alone, but because terror traveled fastest through them. A village could rebuild burned homes. It could bury its dead men. But violated women shattered something deeper. Trust, continuity, the future. Women captured during raids were often assaulted immediately, then marched for days behind armies, exposed, exhausted, bleeding. Those who collapsed were killed. Those who survived were sold. Chroniclers rarely describe these marches in detail, but when they do, the language is unmistakable. Humiliation as spectacle, suffering as warning. In some cases, women were deliberately paraded near enemy fortifications, stripped and abused within sight of walls, meant to provoke surrender. This was psychological warfare. And it worked. Muslim defenders watching from towers were forced to choose between holding position and witnessing the destruction of their families below. Some surrendered, others fought harder. But either way, the damage was done. Christian sources are often evasive here. They use vague phrasing. Captives were taken, the spoils were divided. But Muslim and Jewish accounts are explicit. They speak of women raped repeatedly, sometimes by entire groups of soldiers. They speak of laughter during the acts, of mockery, of prayers spoken over screaming victims. Faith did not restrain brutality. It intensified it. The belief that God sanctioned conquest removed moral limits. To harm an unbeliever was not merely allowed. It was framed as service. Women's suffering became proof of divine favor, evidence that God had delivered enemies into Crusader hands. This mentality reached its peak during prolonged occupations. Cities like Acre and Tyre became hubs of Crusader control, filled with foreign soldiers living among local populations. Women there lived under constant threat. Assault was not confined to moments of conquest. It became part of daily life. Complaints were useless. Local courts favored Crusaders. Church authorities focused on regulating Christian morality, not protecting non-Christians. Violence against women was treated as an unfortunate but inevitable byproduct of war. Sometimes, it was not even treated as unfortunate. There are records of Crusaders boasting about their actions. Songs that joked about captive women. Letters sent home describing exotic conquests. This language stripped women of humanity, reducing them to trophies and curiosities. Even when Crusaders fought one another, women suffered. During internal conflicts between Crusader factions, cities were sacked by fellow Christians. Local women, regardless of faith, were assaulted by whichever side prevailed. Loyalty meant nothing. Power meant everything. And when the Crusaders finally faced defeat, when cities fell back into Muslim hands, the violence did not reverse cleanly. Retaliation followed. Trauma bred trauma. Women on all sides became targets in cycles of vengeance rooted in earlier atrocities. This is where history becomes uncomfortable. Because while Crusader violence against women was extreme, it did not exist in isolation. It reshaped norms. It lowered thresholds. It taught future armies that terrorizing civilians was effective. The Crusades did not invent rape in war, but they normalized it within a framework of righteousness. They showed how belief could erase empathy, how ideology could turn bodies into battlefields. And women understood this long before historians named it. They adapted in ways that broke hearts. Some refused marriage, believing attachment only increased loss. Others avoided childbirth, fearing daughters would inherit their fate. Communities restructured around protection and secrecy, isolating women from public life not out of tradition alone, but survival. This withdrawal changed societies. It altered gender roles, mobility, trust. The scars were not only physical, they were cultural. Yet when European chroniclers later reflected on the Crusades, these consequences were rarely acknowledged. The focus remained on kings and castles, on treaties and territories. Women existed only as abstractions, queens, saints, symbols, not as victims. Their suffering was inconvenient, because to acknowledge it would mean admitting that holy war was never holy, that liberation was a lie told by men who wanted permission, and that permission had consequences. The Crusades taught generations that violence wrapped in faith could excuse anything, that enemies were less than human, that women's bodies were acceptable terrain for conquest. Those lessons did not disappear when the Crusades ended. They echoed into later wars, into colonization, into modern conflicts where rape is still used as a weapon and ideology still provides cover. History does not repeat itself exactly, but it remembers. And the women of the Crusades were among its earliest teachers, though no one listened. Their screams faded. Their names were lost. But the damage they endured became part of the world that followed. Because when brutality is justified once, it is easier to justify again. When the Crusades finally began to fail, when castles fell back into Muslim hands and supply lines collapsed, Europe told itself a story of tragic loss. Brave men, noble sacrifice, a dream undone by distance and disease. But in the lands the Crusaders left behind, the memory was very different. For generations, mothers warned daughters with stories that began the same way. Men from the West, crosses on their chests, smiles that meant nothing. The warning was never about swords first. It was about what came after. About what happened when the shouting stopped and the doors closed. The Crusaders eventually departed. The consequences did not. Women who survived assault carried a burden that followed them for the rest of their lives. In many communities, rape was not only trauma, it was a social death. Victims were blamed for surviving. Some were divorced. Others were forbidden from remarrying. Many were treated as if they carried shame rather than wounds. Silence became the only refuge. Children born from rape were living reminders of conquest. Some were killed at birth. Others were abandoned. A few survived, raised in households that never let them forget their origins. They grew up caught between identities, unwanted by both sides. Proof that violence does not end when armies leave. Communities change to protect themselves, but the protection came at a cost. Women were secluded more tightly. Movement was restricted. Public life narrowed. These shifts were later explained as tradition or religion, but their roots lay in fear. Fear born from Crusader terror. The walls that closed around women were built from memory. Muslim chroniclers never forgot. Neither did Jewish ones. The Crusaders were remembered not as liberators, but as invaders who brought a special kind of cruelty, one that targeted the future by destroying women. This memory hardened resistance. It fueled later calls to holy war on the opposite side. Trauma became ideology. Even centuries later, the word Crusader carried a weight far heavier than battle. In Europe, however, the silence was almost complete. As time passed, Crusader violence was polished into legend. Knights became heroes. Campaigns became epics. Art and literature focused on banners and battles, not on the screams behind closed doors. Women vanished from a narrative unless they were saints, queens, or symbols of purity. Victims did not fit the story. This selective memory mattered. Because when history hides victims, it teaches future generations that suffering can be ignored if it serves a greater cause. That belief did not stay in the Middle Ages. It resurfaced again and again in colonial wars, religious conflicts, modern genocides, where rape was used to break populations and ideology was used to excuse it. The Crusades were not unique in their brutality, but they were uniquely successful at sanctifying it. They showed the world what happens when violence is framed as divine duty. When men believe they act with God's approval, restraint collapses, atrocity becomes obedience, and women become collateral without consequence. There were moments, even then, when this horror could have been confronted. Clerics could have condemned it openly. Chroniclers could have named victims. Leaders could have enforced protection. But most chose silence because silence preserved the myth. And myths are powerful. They survive longer than truth. They are easier to celebrate. They demand less accountability. But the truth has a way of resurfacing. Fragments remain in Arabic chronicles, in Jewish laments, in marginal notes scribbled by uneasy priests, in the uncomfortable gaps where European records go quiet, in the fact that entire regions still remember the Crusades not as history, but as trauma. And at the center of that trauma stand women whose lives were shattered in the name of salvation. They did not march under banners. They did not choose sides. They did not speak at councils or write histories. Yet they paid the highest price for a war they never asked for. When we strip away the armor and the hymns, what remains is simple and terrifying. The Crusades taught the world that faith could be used to justify anything. And once that lesson was learned, it was never unlearned. The women of the Crusades were not footnotes. They were warnings. Warnings about what happens when belief outruns humanity. When victory matters more than mercy. When people stop seeing others as human and start seeing them as obstacles, prizes, or proof, those warnings still matter. Because every time a war claims moral superiority, every time suffering is dismissed as necessary, every time women's bodies become battleground again, the echoes return, not from Jerusalem alone, but from every street where blood once ran and history chose to look away. If these stories unsettle you, they should, because the past is not dead. It is watching, and it remembers who paid the price. Subscribe for more hidden horrors of the past.